Bom dia. Só para checar se a tradução está funcionando. Ah, sim? Ah, is it working? Ok. Uh, Bárbara, can you check if the interpretation is working? Bom dia a todas, todos e todes. Sim? Ok, então tá. Bem, muito bom dia a todos. Seguimos todas e todos, seguimos na nossa programação dessa segunda conferência internacional em direção a um marco regulatório internacional para agrotóxicos. Nessa manhã a gente começa com a fala do nosso keynote speaker, Dr. Marcos Orellana, que é o relator especial das Nações Unidas para substâncias tóxicas e direitos humanos. Eu agradeço demais o Marcos, porque ele fez uma ginástica acrobática para estar aqui com a gente, prestigiar o nosso evento. E a gente quer reconhecer a importância da abordagem do Marcos, que, inclusive, no nosso país fez muita diferença em momentos decisivos, quando o Senado Federal estava para votar sobre um aspecto da regulação de agrotóxicos. A carta que ele enviou ao Senado Federal Brasileiro e a participação dele em uma das audiências públicas foi decisiva. E eu sei por outras pessoas que isso aconteceu em outros lugares do mundo. Então, Marcos, eu passo a palavra para você, manifestando a minha grande admiração, grande gratidão por estar aqui e também por seu olhar, por compartilhar generosamente o seu olhar, sua visão sobre o tema conosco. Hoje a gente, ao final, vai ler uma carta, vai ler uma declaração, a Declaração de Bruxelas, sobre essa necessidade de uma regulação internacional para agrotóxicos. Obrigada, e você tem a palavra.
Sí, aló. Muy buenos días, muchas gracias Larisa por esas palabras de bienvenida. Para mí es un grato honor, me complace tremendamente contar con la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes esta mañana para conversar sobre un tema tan importante como es el marco regulatorio internacional en materia de plaguicidas. Quisiera empezar agradeciendo en primer lugar a la organización que nos recibe, European Anti-Poverty Network, estamos en su casa, y también a las organizaciones convocantes de este espacio por la posibilidad de tener este intercambio. Yo preparé mi presentación en inglés, entonces voy a pasar a hablar en inglés, agradeciéndoles también a los y las traductoras. Para empezar, creo que ya está muy bien documentado el hecho de que... No, I thought I was going to speak in English, so sorry, I need to shift now. Okay, so to begin, I think by now it is quite well documented that exposure to pesticides has human rights implications, and that is why the mandate on toxics and human rights as a special procedure of the Human Rights Council for many years, myself, my predecessor, immediate predecessor, even before that. The first rapporteur, special rapporteur on the toxics mandate, at the time that the mandate was established and created with a focus on hazardous wastes and with a focus on transboundary movements of wastes. But even in that much more limited frame, the first rapporteur expressed concern that the export of hazardous products that then were released to the environment, such as pesticides, was something that needed to be addressed within the terms of the mandate. So in a way, analogizing wastes with products that have similar implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights. The Toxics and Human Rights mandate in time has been reframed. It's no longer focused on transboundary movements on hazardous waste. It includes that dimension, but it addresses the life cycle of chemicals and wastes. And so on that basis, myself and my predecessors have addressed pesticides head on. And again, because exposure to pesticides can result in a wide array of human rights infringements. And I'll come back to these, but just to start, it is not only the release of pesticides during their use, it's also production. So the life cycle beginning before the release. This year, 2024, marks the 40th year anniversary, some would say, in which we commemorate the struggle for justice of the communities in Bhopal, India, that for decades have been struggling and fighting to obtain environmental justice. Let's recall that in early December 1984, the emanations of a hazardous gas killed thousands overnight, many more over the coming days. And as dramatic as that is, it often eclipses the fact that the facility in Bhopal had contaminated the soils and the waters for years before this accident happened and continued to do so for decades after the accident. There were claims because of that contamination from the facility presented, for example, in US courts, given that Union Carbide, the American corporation that owned, controlled, and supervised and transferred technology to the Indian subsidiary, is an American corporation. And yet, American courts, as I presented in a statement a couple weeks ago, commemorating these 40 years, have denied justice to the victims. And so human rights infringements of pesticides along the life cycle, beginning with the production and fence-line communities. A third introductory point, and again, I'll unpack this in a few minutes, are that our current responses are fragmented and largely ineffective. International responses on human rights law or international environmental law or regional law or internal law. And that's why my predecessor, cooperating with the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Hilal Elber, this name may be familiar to some of you, and Bashkut Tungjak, the former Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, they made a call on a treaty, an international treaty to regulate pesticides. Now that call has fallen largely on the deaf ears of governments that have not picked it up. But the time is ripe because the impacts are aggravating, they're continuing and they're intensifying. They're not going away. So this is not an issue that is going stale. So with that very brief introduction, let me get into unpacking some of these elements. So first of all, the diagnosis. What is the problem? From a human rights perspective, the human rights infringements of exposure to the right to food, as it has been interpreted by the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights that oversees implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights and produces what are authoritative interpretations of that covenant. This committee has pronounced itself that the right to food includes the right to safe food that is free from adverse substances, free from pesticides that can cause health implications. There's certainly also the right to health that's involved, and the same Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights has elaborated in its general comments on the health dimensions and the underlying dimensions of health in connection with the underlying determinants of health. So food, health, there's several other rights that are implicated. The right to life itself, we look at this situation from the perspective of civil and political rights. So this is the big distinction in the post Second World War and Cold War era between civil rights, civil and political rights, and economic, social, cultural rights. It's not just a matter of progressive development issues in the economic sphere, it's also the right to life being implicated, and that's where the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations that oversees implementation and compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has examined cases of allegations and violations of human rights in connection with massive spraying of pesticides in Paraguay, for example, where it pronounced on the international responsibility of Paraguay for human rights violations in connection with aerial spraying that has affected the life and health and other rights of communities there. The case of Cáceres Portillo, for example. I had the opportunity to conduct an official country visit to Paraguay, visited the widow of Mr. Portillo, the sites where these places, these sprayings took place. They are not an isolated case. It is a pattern of non-compliance with measures that are established in the laws of Paraguay for protection of communities, but are ignored. They're not complied with. They exist on paper, so not in reality. Human rights, law and policy intends to confront that reality where people suffer harm or risk of harm. Other rights that I wish to mention, the right to water. Yesterday, my colleague, Special Rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation, I believe, had the opportunity to participate in the conference as well. We've worked together on issues of chlordecone in Martinique, for example, among many others. But that's where the right to water comes to play, because water is life, and if water is contaminated with hazardous substances, then of course we have a human rights issue. One recent right that has been, let me put it differently. The right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment has recently been internationally recognized by the UN General Assembly and by the UN Human Rights Council. Now, the right to a healthy environment certainly is implicated when poisons are spread into the environment, which concerns certainly human health, human life, and the range of issues that I'm talking about, but also environmental health, the health of soils, biodiversity, the relationship between predators and pests and prey and so forth. So there's a lot that can be unpacked there. And in connection with all of this, a fundamental principle of human rights law and policy is that if there is an infringement of human rights, there must be an effective remedy for the victims. And often what ends up happening is that people who suffer from the adverse impacts of exposure to pesticides are left out without a remedy. And there are several reasons for this. One, the systematic campaigns of disinformation by the pesticide industry, the systematic denial, the tactics of diverting attention and questioning causation, the difficulty of establishing causation between exposure and clinical manifestation of harm. All of this, well, the lack of capacities in national judiciaries, in addition to lobbying and political pressure. So there's a lot that goes into explaining why there's a lack of, a systematic lack of remedies. A human rights-based approach puts emphasis on the situation of people in vulnerable situations. Those who suffer most in society have the least opportunity to protect themselves because of lack of political power, lack of economic power in the marketplace, for whatever reason, or for biological reasons. Children, because of their physical composition, the ratio of the body and it's growing, not to get too much into the science, of course, but to keep it simple, the impacts of pesticides are disproportionately felt by children. In October, I presented to the UN General Assembly a report on gender and toxics, documenting the disproportionate impacts of chemicals and wastes on women and girls, endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example. So there's that as well. Workers in the field. I had the opportunity to conduct a country visit to South Africa, where I met women workers in the fields who spoke about exposure, lack of protective equipment, lack of information, lack of opportunities to organize, abuses by employers, etc. And certainly about illnesses, deaths in family, cancers, and so forth. And we should also mention future generations. Some of the impacts operate at a chromosomal level that then get passed on to future generations. So that raises also a sobering point. So we have a situation of discrimination and exploitation at a systematic level worldwide. I have sometimes made the comparison or the analogy with the situation of slavery back in a couple centuries ago, where the abolitionist movement worked for decades to put an end to this situation. Now, at the time, it seemed normal to many, because that's how our human minds work. No, things are normal until they're challenged. And this is the moment to challenge what is an odious practice that is incompatible with the enjoyment of human rights and is resulting in cruel exploitation around the world. Another element of the diagnosis, as I mentioned, is fragmentation. And so here I wish to elaborate on and present a couple of international instruments that are dealing with this problem and present some of their weaknesses. The Rotterdam Convention on International Trade in Industrial Chemicals and Pesticides. So this is an instrument that is a quite simple instrument. It's on prior informed consent. The notion that before an international trade takes place, the importing country will consent to the movement of that product. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because for several reasons. The prior informed consent procedure applies to the pesticides and chemicals that are listed in an annex. And that annex contains a list of chemicals that are largely obsolete and in disuse. And the attempts to include new chemicals and pesticides in that annex have not been successful because they require, by the terms of the treaty, consensus. And that has been interpreted by many as unanimity. And so there are some countries where the pesticide lobby is particularly strong that have systematically blocked consensus, such as Guatemala, such as Argentina, Brazil at times, among others. This is in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are other countries that do not wish to set a precedent in respect of other chemicals, not on pesticides. So Russia, India, in respect of asbestos, for example. And so we're left with a non-functional instrument that cannot be used appropriately or adequately to deal with this problem. In addition, in order to make prior informed consent determinations. So in order for the importing country to say, we don't want this import, or yes, we do want this import, there needs to be an assessment, no? And that requires capacity. And for the most, around the world, countries do not have that capacity to make proper assessments of, even when they receive a file and a dossier and information, they do not have that information, that capacity to assess that. So there's that Rotterdam Convention. There's a couple other conventions at the international level. The Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances. It can address pesticides insofar as those pesticides may affect the ozone layer. So not QA pesticides, but in respect of the objectives of protecting the ozone layer. And so what is the coverage of the Montreal Protocol in respect of pesticides? It's very limited, but at the same time useful. So for example, in respect of methyl bromide, that is often used in international trade because it provides an opportunity for the exporter to meet quarantine requirements, and so the products enter international trade in that sense. There's been phase out. There's also the possibility of exemptions. Some countries have routinely requested and obtained exemptions without any time bound. So there's gaps as well. But the point is that this is not a treaty about pesticides. It can address here and there, but it doesn't address the hundreds and thousands of chemistries that we're talking about here. And a similar situation is apparent with the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Again, largely I would say an effective, a robust instrument that is able to identify POPs for the acronym, categorize them whether they need a ban or a restriction or controls for unintended releases. I'm simplifying the instrument. But then again, it's not focused on pesticides. In order for a pesticide to be addressed under this instrument, it needs to fall under the scope of the criteria that define a persistent organic pollutant in the terms of that agreement. So persistence, capable of long-range transport, among others. Well, certainly harmful for human health and the environment. If it does not meet these criteria, then it's out. Yeah? And so the coverage of the Stockholm Convention in respect of pesticides is quite limited. In the international human rights and environmental field, recently we've also seen the elaboration of so-called implementation agreements. And that's because they implement the Rio Declaration Principle 10. Now, a bit of a background there. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, what it sought to do back in 1992, recast the development idea into sustainable development, bringing in future generations, but understanding development as a process of dialogue in society, based on information and public participation, and based on access to remedies. So procedural elements, where the conversation, in order to confront the threats, would provide answers. The answers wouldn't be given ex ante, but they would result from this dialogue. So implementation agreements to elaborate on standards of information and participation. And based on those standards, such as the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean, pesticides have been part of that conversation. But again, it's in respect of the process, not of the substance. And so that's where the limitations of these agreements begin to show. Voluntary approaches. There is a code of an international code of conduct for pesticide management by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization, which is quite useful and important, especially for countries that do not have legislation or did not have legislation at the time. But it's also voluntary, and there are significant shortcomings in this agreement, in this instrument. For example, it does not refer to the rights of indigenous peoples. This is something that I pointed out in my report on indigenous peoples and toxics, and it has led, I believe, to a process of where revision is being studied. There's also very recently coming out of last year's International Conference on Chemicals Management, an initiative for a global alliance on highly hazardous pesticides, building on the positive precedent of the alliance on lead paint. Now, this is also important because it helps channel resources into countries in order to strengthen national capacities and laws. But it's very slow and it's very gradual, and it doesn't necessarily get at the harmonization and other benefits that an international agreement could reach. There's also the question of disparate laws at the national level, and that's, for example, where the export of banned pesticides come in. So pesticides that are banned or restricted for use in a given territory and nevertheless allowed by that jurisdiction for production for export. I've denounced this as discrimination, odious double standards, and a form of exploitation. But I've also pointed out that it's a shared responsibility between the exporting country and the importing country, because we could often get the argument by industry and the exporting country, well, we are respecting the sovereignty of the importing country. Often that's euphemism because sovereignty masks the lack of capacity. There's really no capacity to deal with this. And it masks the corporate capture of the state. So much could be said there. I could further elaborate on the substance by substance approach and the issues of risk and hazard. But given the time and given the topic of the conference, I thought I'd elaborate a few thoughts on an international treaty. What is an international treaty? What could an international treaty do? And so, again, without getting into a long disquisition, but an international treaty is an international agreement that sets international obligations. And so that sets a kind of a floor, a minimum standard. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters in that these obligations, in order to be effective, then get as it were, translated into national law. So it's the power of the state and its institutions and its regulations in order to give effect to that agreement. As we know, states have very different capacities, and so in many states, state exists on paper, and in the field, there is a battle that's raging for control over territory between communities and corporations. But the state, at the same time, is the world order that we know, that exists with the United Nations, international law, and national level institutions. So these are the tools that are there. Now, what could an international treaty do, an international treaty on pesticides or highly hazardous pesticides? Well, a couple of thoughts here. First, it would highlight the importance of the problem. So this is, in a way, the discursive dimension. Thoughts and ideas are power, and so challenging what I was mentioning earlier about the normalization of things. So raising the visibility, raising the profile of the problem. So that's one. It can establish controls. So bans, restrictions, procedures. Well, certainly most international environmental treaties provide for the possibility of exemptions. Now, why is that? One would wonder, well, if we want to have an effective instrument, why provide for the opportunity for an exemption? Say DDT is well known in its hazardous impact. It's banned, and yet there are exemptions allowed for health reasons. Well, those exemptions for balancing and also to make it possible also for states to adhere to this. So the flexibility is needed. Otherwise, states with very strong positions would not become a party, because becoming a party to a treaty is a matter of discretion. It's voluntary in that sense. Now, once a state becomes a party, then it's binding. An international treaty is binding by definition, well, depending on the terms of the treaty. So controls on what? Certainly on pesticides, the chemistries themselves, the products, but also it could deal with the issues of containers and used containers, which is a very serious problem that I've documented in all my country visits, where used containers become hazardous waste, often are used to store water or even store milk. They could deal, this instrument could deal with obsolete stocks of pesticides. It could deal with protective equipment and standards as such, and so forth. There's a number of issues there. A treaty could establish minimum standards. Now, harmonization, some would say, now harmonization upwards. So setting a floor, not a ceiling, in connection, for example, with residues or in connection with labeling. So there's a number of things there. A treaty could establish a science policy interface. This is not unknown. And what is a science policy interface in this area? Well, new chemistries are being developed all the time. Are they safe? Now, changing the burden of proof, there could be a scientific committee that assesses them and recommends controls. This is the model of the Stockholm Convention. In Rotterdam, as we mentioned, it doesn't work. The Stockholm Convention, it works better. So there's some precedent there. An international treaty could also channel international cooperation. There could be an information clearinghouse. There could be efforts at capacity building, targeted, and so forth. An international treaty could also set up structures to monitor compliance, such as through a compliance committee, a peer review process, or reporting mechanisms. So these are elements that give us a glimpse, as it were, of some of the potential benefits of an international treaty. But isn't it necessary? Is such an instrument necessary to put an end to the export of prohibited subsidies? I will argue, no, it's not. Countries can act unilaterally in this area, and they are starting to. We are in Brussels. Belgium has adopted measures that are quite important, precedent-setting in respect of this problem, and other countries have done as well. But there's arguments. Some countries argue, well, what use is it for my country jurisdiction to ban the export of hazardous pesticides if that will simply displace production elsewhere and the problem will continue? That is where an international treaty comes into place, a global approach, so that those gaps are addressed. There's also the argument that, and I had this conversation with representatives of government and also CropLife, so the Association of Pesticide Marketers and Manufacturers in Australia. They're saying, well, the conditions that exist in Europe are not the same that exist in Australia, and so why should we have the same standards? Well, there are answers to that. The human body is the same everywhere, for example, but it does point to the difference between risk and hazard. And so a product may be hazardous, so the argument goes, but not pose a risk if it is managed properly, if there's protective equipment. And so why would we, as society, deprive ourselves from the benefit of a product if we can manage the risk? Now, that sounds suggestive, but there's a lot that is masked under that argument, because again, some products are so hazardous that protective equipment don't work. They cannot be managed safely. protective equipment may not be available, it puts the onus on the weakest link, so the burden on the workers in the field, instead of placing the responsibilities on the producers of the hazardous product. But more fundamentally, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lack of capacity in countries to make determinations of risk, because this is an information-intensive process. It requires long-term studies, epidemiology, toxicology, and etc. And so being able to make proper risk assessments is often a mask simply for continuing the status quo. And in that sense, I've argued that risk assessments are nothing but a guise for the continuation of racist and exploitative policies. There's also the question of sovereignty and compliance with national law that I mentioned, so I won't repeat. In connection with this debate, some of you may be familiar with the tools of special procedures. The mandate holder, I sent a letter, for example, to Germany a couple of years ago about the question of the export of prohibited pesticides. And the answer I received is, well, we are looking at what the European Union will do. And when action is taken at the regional level, we will certainly implement that as a matter of course. Sure, okay, that in a way that's fair response. It sounds rather formalistic, but it also underlying that, or underneath that, is the fact that in order for there to be action at the EU level, there needs to be an initiative and champions and a process for that. And so where is the leadership in moving that process forward? The EU chemical strategy for sustainability is an important pledge, and pledges are important, no? But also politicians at times are full of empty promises. And is the chemical strategy panning out? Well, it seems to be replaced by an emphasis on industry and industrial policy. And in that regard, I wish to stress that there cannot be a successful industrial policy without placing the right to a healthy environment at its core. And so the chemical strategy cannot be abandoned, and these pledges need to be transformed into actual measures, legislation that can then be implemented at the national level. So I believe I extended more than time, apologies, but in conclusion, what we're seeing here with the release of ever-growing amounts of pesticides into the environment is a growing toxification of our planet. This has been documented by science, where planetary boundaries are being exceeded. We speak of the triple planetary crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss and ecosystem services, and certainly toxic pollution. Toxic pollution doesn't get much attention, actually because it's largely invisible, but yet it is affecting our collective intelligence, it is affecting our ability to reproduce as a human species, and it is having a range of serious adverse impacts on fundamental human rights, with millions of people being undermined in their effective enjoyment. And so because of that, we need new tools to confront what is a planetary emergency and put an end to the ongoing discrimination. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to be with you today.
Bem, muitíssimo obrigada, Marcos Orellana, por ter nos mostrado, primeiro, um panorama geral de como a questão dos agrotóxicos pode ser abordada pelas Nações Unidas, e segundo, por dar essa visão tão ampla, ao mesmo tempo ampla e profunda, sobre a potência de um tratado internacional para agrotóxicos, o que acho que só mostra que a gente está caminhando, busca caminhar na direção certa. Bem, então, se você está disponível para algumas questões, acho que a gente pode aproveitar essa presença e abrir para uma sessão de algumas Pergunta, sim? Pedro? Sim, acho que você pode vir e se identificar e fazer sua questão.
Bom dia a todos e a todas, aqueles que estão também à distância. Eu sou Pedro Serafim, sou Procurador-Geral do Trabalho do Brasil e represento aqui o Fórum Nacional de Combate aos Impactos Agrotóxicos como coordenador. E quero, nesse momento, dizer da minha alegria, do contentamento de estar aqui e aprender muita coisa, inclusive levar como instrumento de trabalho no Brasil. O Fórum é um plano comunitário e o exponente falou muito bem nessa questão também do envolvimento comunitário e de providências de instrumentos. E eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta ao doutor Marcos. Qual a possibilidade, por exemplo, o Brasil está numa crise muito séria no que diz respeito à desregulamentação dos pesticidas. Vossa Senhoria se pronunciou muito bem no momento, já foi dito aqui, perante o Senado, eu estava naquela audiência pública, foi muito importante. Essa lei nova que desregulamentou o sistema está na Suprema Corte com a arguição de inconstitucionalidade. Perguntou a Vossa Excelência se, no caso de não ultrapassar ou não ser favorável a essa ação que os movimentos sociais, partidos políticos, entraram no Supremo, qual a possibilidade e o caminho em relação à questão dos direitos humanos, especificamente, de se apresentar uma queixa internacional no Tribunal das Nações Unidas para responsabilizar o governo, na verdade, o governo brasileiro, certo, em relação a essas afrontas todas, porque principalmente se tirou do arcabouço, do conjunto legal, a possibilidade, a participação direta do setor de saúde e ambiental, ficando apenas o aspecto econômico, que é o Ministério da Agricultura. Qual seria, portanto, a possibilidade ou os caminhos que os movimentos sociais, inclusive o Fórum, encabeçando mais 33 fóruns estaduais, poderia fazer uma queixa, apresentar uma queixa no órgão das Nações Unidas.
Outras questões? Edmilson, acho que você levantou a mão. Você quer vir fazer?
Bom dia, sou Edmilson Costa, da Federação dos Trabalhadores Rurais e Agricultores Familiares do Estado do Maranhão, FETAEMA. Também a gente compõe o Fórum Permanente contra os Agrotóxicos pela Vida e a Rede Agroecológica do Maranhão, a RAMA. A gente já estivemos em setembro, Dr. Marcos, em Genebra, lá na Suíça, onde a gente teve um momento com o senhor. Então, a gente tratava já essa questão dos agrotóxicos, sobretudo, que está afetando diretamente o Estado brasileiro, mas, sobretudo, o Maranhão. E a gente trouxe vários fatos, né, que estão acontecendo, de fato, estão matando pessoas, crianças, e aí o senhor trouxe aqui algo importante, que é referente que a ONU tem definido muito o alimento como algo essencial. E no Brasil, especialmente, pessoas estão passando fome nos seus territórios devido ao uso indiscriminado de agrotóxicos, onde esse agrotóxico está expulsando essas famílias e está sendo utilizado como uma arma química para expulsar suas comunidades, seus territórios, as pessoas que os habitam, ou seja, está nos expulsando. E eu gostaria de saber qual a medida que o senhor, enquanto relator de tóxicos e direitos humanos, pode estar vendo de imediato para que a gente possa, de uma vez por todas, coibir essa prática indevida, tendo em vista que alguns estados não têm mais legislação que visa a pulverização aérea de agrotóxicos, por exemplo. Aqui tem, por exemplo, Ceará está incorrendo risco já de ter esse retrocesso na questão, e qual a medida que a gente pode tomar mais urgente, né, enquanto ONU, vocês no caso, para que o Brasil, o Estado brasileiro como um todo e as comunidades que estão sendo afetadas, possa ter essa paz e possa ter a segurança alimentar e nutricional, que é tão necessária e urgente para o nosso Estado. Obrigado.
Uhum.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Rother. I'm head of the Environmental Health Division at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you for a fantastic keynote speech. It covered so many issues. So I have two questions. One is, it's very hard to get a new treaty in place. There's a lot of pushback, it's expensive, and trying to get the commitment. Would it be more effective and have a bigger reach if one went for a chemicals treaty? Or would it actually water down the focus on pesticides, which we really do need, if we had a pesticide treaty? So the question is, would we have a better chance if we maybe went for a code of conduct on chemicals management that then would lead toward a treaty for chemicals management and pesticides under that? Because we're having so many conventions at the moment. Now we've got this new plastic treaty that's on the table, and it's going to continue to fragment the whole focus. So that's the first question. The second question is, you spoke quite a lot, Marcus, about human rights and the kind of text for human rights. And we've been trying to get a human rights-based approach in some of the guidelines that we've been developing on pesticides. For example, in the joint JMPM, joint management, joint meeting on pesticide management, sorry, I forgot, with FAO and WHO. And there's been pushback on getting kind of a standardized and generic's not the right word, but a standardized text on human rights in guidelines, and then that could be used in national legislation. Is there a possibility to kind of push that approach a bit more, that there's a standardized human rights based approach text for pesticide management and risk reduction that could be used, or generally in guidelines, as well as in legislation and national legislation to help countries? Thanks.
So I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you very much for the comments and also the questions. So first of all, on the question of what is happening in Brazil with the new pesticide laws, also referred to as the poison package. Perhaps to recall that my predecessor in the mandate had the opportunity to conduct an official country visit to Brazil in 2019. And in this country visit, he already reported on some of these issues. Since then, there have been several initiatives and attempts by special procedures of the Human Rights Council to highlight the risks of what was at the time a bill being debated in the Brazilian Congress. I've also sent letters to the Brazilian government in regards to the impacts of aerial spraying in Pernambuco and in other places as a pattern. And so, as you rightly mentioned, I did have the opportunity to speak at a hearing in the Senate committee that was debating this. So what's next? As you rightly point out, this law has now been challenged in its constitutionality before the Brazilian Supreme Court. A couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to submit an amicus curiae brief in that process, building on this engagement. An amicus curiae brief is a written brief presented by an entity like myself in this instance that is not a party to the litigation, that contains information that can help the judges better decide the case. And in this instance, this brief elaborates on international standards, human rights standards, that are relevant for the appreciation of the issues of the case, such as the duty of the state to prevent exposure to hazardous substances, the duty of the state to establish a robust framework to address environmental risks, and the duty of the state to not regress on existing levels of environmental and health protection. In that regard, in connection with the duty of non-regression, there is an important precedent in coming out from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the case of La Oroya versus Peru, which is the first case where this regional human rights court has addressed the right to a healthy environment in the context of toxics. And it has very clearly pronounced itself on this duty of non-regression. And so this is an important element in the role of the national judiciary in upholding international human rights standards, in interpreting national constitutions in light of human rights standards, especially as the issues relate to protected rights in the national constitutions. So that could lead then eventually, after exhaustion of remedies, to claims before regional monitoring bodies that would adjudicate on a case involving violations of the right to a healthy environment. So I'll leave it at that with that question. On Maranhão, thank you for highlighting that and raising that. There's two things I wish to point, or three things. One, the mandate that I have been given by the Human Rights Council is a monitoring and reporting mandate. And so that is in the raising visibility and bringing information to various layers of international attention, national level attention, the media, so that society can engage in the issue, with the issues that are being presented. So that's one thing. Another is on the allegation that pesticides are being used as chemical weapons. This is not a new allegation in the sense that it has already been reported by my predecessor in the 2019 country visit to Brazil. Now, it does raise a couple things. So pesticides are justified and because of their intended use as plant protection products or plant defense products. But if they're used in other ways, the justification begins to evaporate and become unjustifiable. Now, that's one nuance. Another is, what is the definition of a chemical weapon at the international level? In The Hague, there's a secretary of the Chemical Weapons Convention. There is a legal dimension to this problem that I will be, and this is my third point, I will be examining in my forthcoming report to the UN General Assembly next October, that will focus on military activities and toxics. Because the definition of chemical weapons in that convention, I believe, is sufficiently broad to address chemicals that may be used as weapons, such as pesticides. But this is something that I will look in detail and report on in that context. Then on the question of the tactical question of whether an international treaty and what would be the scope, the preferred scope, and so forth. So pushback against the treaty, yes, I think we're seeing some pushback against treaty proliferation. So, but at the same time, so we're, as an international community, today embarked in the elaboration of an international treaty on plastic pollution. This is the most recent multilateral environmental agreement under elaboration. Today's 2024, almost 2025. The process began a couple of years ago. Before that, the last MEA for the acronym, Minamata Convention on Mercury. So that more than 10 years ago. So that's not a lot of treaties either. But the treaty process is indeed expensive. And so do we have champions, countries that are willing to lead and put money on the table in order to get a process that can get us there? So that is certainly a big question. But then, as you point out, on scope, if we look at Minamata as an example, as a precedent, that process started at the UN Environment Program that had studied the impacts of mercury, that had studied the impacts of other chemicals and heavy metals. At the then governing council of UNEP, today the UN Environment Assembly, UNEA, it was proposed that there should be a convention on heavy metals, broad scope, that would address cadmium and lead and nickel and others. And there was no political appetite. This is a phrase I don't find rather distasteful, but there wasn't much appetite to do that. And instead, we ended up with one chemical. Now, it was thought to be more practical to deal with extraction and production, refinement and trade and wastes and uses and so forth of that very hazardous one chemical, mercury. So we could get somewhere. And still we have gaps in that instrument where the largest source of emissions and releases to the environment is small-scale gold mining, which under the terms of the Minamata Agreement is an allowed use for mercury. And so instead of, it's a robust agreement and it's working in every aspect except in the elephant of the room, which is the largest source, which is small-scale gold mining. And it puts the finger on countries that produce, that extract gold, instead of also dealing with, well, what happens with the refineries in Switzerland, in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in the Arab Emirates, in South Africa, in China, etc. Anyways, so the scope is an important element. Now, should it be broader to deal with all chemicals? There have been proposals for a chemicals framework convention. They have been set aside for an elaboration of non-binding global framework on chemicals. And this is what came out from the 5th session of the International Conference on Chemical Management last year in Bonn as a voluntary framework. When the FAO and the WHO prepared their International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management as an instrument of soft law, some saw it as a process that could eventually transform into hard law, because that's often the trajectory to get into a treaty. First, soft law instruments, studies, the science, voluntary approaches, and then we lay the basis of national law to create an international treaty. But it hasn't happened. And why not? Well, there is orchestrated, organized resistance from very powerful interests that make a lot of profit from the status quo. So let's recognize that. So that on the treaty. On a human rights-based approach, I'm not surprised by pushback against incorporating human rights in the guidelines. It is a heavy lift. It is important. What is a human rights-based approach? So this can take a while, but some key elements. The ability of people to know what are the risks and harms that they are exposed to, so access to information. The ability to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect them, so elements of democratic governance, especially on questions of risk that are threatening the enjoyment of human rights. An emphasis, as I mentioned earlier, an emphasis on groups that may find themselves in vulnerable situations in society. But there's also the question of the difference between minimizing risk or reducing risk and preventing risk, or preventing risk as much as possible. And so the qualifiers begin to introduce nuances. Environmental law, comparatively around the world as it has evolved after the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, which was the first time the United Nations brought the world together to address these issues and environment became part of the consciousness and of the public debate, and that led to the incorporation of the right to a healthy environment in constitutions and the development of environment ministries and environmental laws around the world. Environmental laws have largely focused on process and assessing and mitigating impacts and reducing harm. And so they largely have been blamed for legitimizing gradually the slow destruction of our planet, the toxification of our planet. And we need a change of direction. And that's where a human rights-based approach comes into play, because human rights law and policy contain the promise of the right to life, not to some people, but to every person, that no one will be left behind, and that regulatory decisions will not mean that, yes, there's those over there will die, and that's okay. No, well, it's not okay from a human rights-based perspective. And that's where prevention of risk becomes very different from reduction of risk or minimization of risk. But at the same time, we live in post-industrial societies or industrializing societies that have at times been called the societies of risk. And how can we deal with that? This is the world that we live in today. And so we're facing serious challenges, and in a way, the front lines of this conceptual but also quite practical debate are in the implementation of the right to a healthy environment. What does that mean in practice, in concrete terms, in terms of government policies? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos Orellana. Acho que sua fala foi muito inspiradora. É uma luz no caminho que a gente deve seguir. Muito, muito obrigada. Estou muito feliz que você tenha podido estar aqui conosco e ajudar nessa construção. Muito obrigada também pelas perguntas, muito importantes, Andréa. Obrigada por ter feito essa pergunta também, porque é um dilema, né? Como lidar com essa questão. Então, bem, estou muito feliz que estejamos aqui fazendo esse debate. Eu vou, então, encaminhar para a construção do painel 5. Nós temos algumas pessoas aqui presencialmente, a Marta Messa, do Slow Food, e a Lena Luig, da Fundação Heinrich Böll. E eu queria chamar vocês duas para comporem a mesa aqui conosco. Nós temos também algumas pessoas que vão participar online. A Susan Hoffman, o Ikena Donald e a Rachel Corborn. Então, eu vou começar com a Marta Messa. E depois, talvez, Lena, eu faça uma mistura com as pessoas que estão online para a gente não fazer só um bloco presencial e outro online. Bem, então, a Marta Messa é parte do movimento Slow Food desde 2010. Difícil de acreditar, vendo esse rosto jovem. E ela é mãe de 2 crianças também. E ela começou a coordenar uma iniciativa agroecológica na África, lidando com práticas sustentáveis e empoderamento das comunidades. Eu estou lendo em inglês e falando em português, então eu acho que eu vou ler o trecho da sua bio em inglês que vai facilitar. Marta then established the Brussels office, positioning it as a hub for slow foods advocacy in Europe. In July 2022, Marta was elected Secretary General of Slow Foods, where she continues to champion the movement's mission on a global stage. So, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Larissa. And yes, also the opening was very interesting and very inspiring. Yes, and connected to what was one of the discussion we just heard earlier about, the international framework, or what are the steps to get to a framework where we held governments, companies accountable for what is happening on pesticides. We have actually been looking as Slow Food with other partner organizations into what could be immediate steps that we can take, starting from the European perspective. Maybe one thing I should do, I forgot, but for those of you who do not know Slow Food, it's a global grassroots movement. It was born in the 80s in Italy, but now it has local groups of volunteers in 160 countries worldwide. We also have a very nice network in Brazil. Yes, you're right, the interpreters. And yes, we've been carrying out activities throughout these many years to promote food that is good for those who grow it, good for those who eat it, and good for the planet. We have different kinds of activities, but really bringing together all actors across the food system. So farmers, food producers, retailers as well, individuals, and so on. So when it comes to what are the political tools that we can start using to keep in check this situation, we look specifically at something that could be within reach at European level, and that is mirror measures. So mirror measures are a policy tool that can be integrated in European legislation to make sure that basically all imported products into the European Union respect the same legislation laws that exist in Europe. So we know, it's been part of the discussion of these days, that if we take this angle just to have a key to understand the situation, there is disparity between the products that are grown in Europe and those that are imported. And what is really happening, given how many calories and proteins Europe is importing, which is about 30% of its consumption. What is happening is that basically Europe is outsourcing all the production that is polluting, and not only polluting, but is really impacting communities in very serious and unethical ways, as we've been hearing. It's basically outsourcing it and then importing these products grown in a way that would not be allowed in Europe. Worse than that, we know very well that Europe is also banning pesticides that then it allows anyways to export to be used in the same productions that then are being imported in Europe. So the Commission, the European Commission in this case, had already made a commitment during the last mandate to resolve this export of pesticides. Nothing has happened yet, so we're following up on that. And the European Union and the Commission also have in place a number of legislation that are quite good. They're not perfect. There is no perfection. Let's not fool ourselves. It's not like Europe is the perfect player here. But in terms of environmental standards, in terms of animal welfare standards, in terms of the sustainability, it's, if you want, like we already have a quite advanced framework. Again, there could be much more that would need to be done, but there is already quite an advanced framework. And so the idea of the mirror measures is essentially that to say, okay, again, all the products imported need to respect at least the rules that we have in Europe. This is something that could be part of any European legislation. So what we're saying is to this Commission, and to this new parliament, look at how you can integrate these reflex in all your legislation, because there is also, of course, another tool that is the mirror clauses, but those are basically specific adds-on to trade agreements, but it doesn't change the framework. So already having mirror measures would be a first step, not the final one, but a first step to go in that direction. And it's something that could be within reach. Now, in saying that, there is just one thing that I want to highlight. It's, just as we've also heard many times the argument that, we're respecting the sovereignty of other countries if they want to import our, pesticides and whatnot. We're also hearing, yes, mirror measures, it's protectionism. We are not looking at it in that way. We're looking at that as a tool to basically encourage higher sustainability elsewhere. It's really about the coherence, but also ethics of what we're doing in terms of what we're anyways outsourcing as Europe to the rest of the world. And the mirror measures can also be a first step in terms of having these, starting a path towards an international kinds of framework, because we argued in a report that is online and that said, if you Google slow food and mirror measures, you'll find it. But basically mirror measures, they must be based on internationally recognized health, environmental and human rights objectives in order to comply with international law. So again, it's just a small entry point to make sure that we go in the direction of a framework. Preparing this report, being a global movement, we also discussed this topic with our communities in the Global South. And in the report, indeed, you also find commentaries from our colleagues, for instance, in Kenya and in Uganda, where they witness, we're also hearing from the colleagues today, but also from our Slow Food Network in Brazil, all the injustices that are really happening, and now communities, through different means, whether it's indeed pesticides used as a weapon or land grabbing, but there is no food sovereignty. If we're talking about food sovereignty, there is none of that in situations where governments are not acting in the interests of the communities, but in the interests of the big investors, of big governments and big corporations. Maybe just to wrap up, one of the things that we're really insisting on, or that's the way we work as Slow Food, is that whilst mirror measures can be a tool, for us it's also very clear that all of us need to play a role. And there are lots of impressive farmers and producers across the world implementing agroecology, so adopting the principles of agroecology. And what we're trying to do is to support them, bring them together in a network. There is also networks, there are also many other actors in the food system that are committed to this kind of respectful food and farming that can be even more impactful and immediate in terms of effect on the local communities, by creating these really networks that are developing local food systems, much more than looking at feeding faraway markets where exchanging beef for beef and apples for apples, where it doesn't make much sense. So maybe I'll stop here so that we can engage in the discussion also with the others. Thank you again so much.
Thank you so much, Marta. Eu não mencionei a Alexandra Caterbol. Eu li os participantes da mesa fora da ordem, não a mencionei, peço desculpas, mas eu gostaria de passar a palavra para você. A Alexandra is a co-founder and co-director of Health and Environmental Justice Support International. Her work focuses on chemical and waste policies, as well as sustainable consumption and production. HAG support aims to achieve a healthy environment and environmental justice on a global, regional, and national level. Alexandra is a political scientist and social psychologist and has a degree in journalism. She works on chemicals policy on EU and international level for more than 16 years. Thank you so much, Alexandra. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for having me. And it was a pleasure to listen to my previous speakers. And yeah, so please, next slide. So we work a lot on chemicals and products, and I'm happy to present to you today a slightly different or additional perspective. So next slide, please. It's not working. Yes, so you can skip this because you already mentioned it. Thank you very much. Hey Support is an expert organization, and we focus on chemicals and products. And now the next slide, please. So, yes, the additional perspective that I was mentioning is pesticides are commonly found in consumer products as well. So it's like a different different perspective, and it's a different angle on what, besides all the other terrible things that pesticides do. So we have pesticides in personal care products like menstrual products, tampons, or menstrual pads. In tampons, for instance, glyphosate has been found several times. Of course, there are pesticides in textiles and furniture, upholstery, or even toys. Next slide, please. This is posing really a risk on human health and the environment at every stage of the life cycle of this product. Pesticides in textiles are commonly found. So you find them in the raw materials like cotton, and there's extensive work being done on pesticides in cotton by Pan UK, for instance. Then you find pesticides in plastic fibers. Plastic fibers make up 80% of all clothes that we have. And you have pesticides in applications to clothes, like anti-odor. And I'm using here not like the EU definition or view on pesticides. I'm using pesticides in agriculture and beyond, including biocides here. So all this is posing a huge risk to workers, farmers, also the communities at production sites, for instance, in Bangladesh, where we are recently having a project where we do community-based monitoring at textile production sites. It also poses a risk to consumers and waste handlers. It's a risk to the human health, but also to the environment. For communities, it can be difficult then to continue fishing, providing with basic food for those communities. And next slide, please. So from this perspective, and also from everything that has been said previously, an ambitious pesticide regulation is needed. So this will have positive effects also on other sectors, on product-related regulation and products. So with this, all-day consumer products will be safer for human health and the environment. Next slide, please. So you may know that last year, the Global Forum on Chemicals was established as a successor of SciChem, Strategic Approach on International Chemicals Management. And at this conference called ICCM5 in September last year, this new instrument decided on a global alliance on highly hazardous pesticides. And I will not talk more about this because I would like to draw your attention that there were also other things decided. For instance, 2 targets related to information about chemicals and products. One is target B1, and you can read it here on my slide, and then B2. And basically it says that governments or all stakeholders should make comprehensive data and information on chemicals in products along the value chain available to everyone. And this is actually a game changer, because usually information is being shared, if it is being shared on products, only B2B, like from business to business along the supply chain, if they are lucky. So what this says is that this should go throughout the value chain, meaning including consumers, including waste handlers, including also regulators who often do not have this information. Next slide, please. As Hazelboard, together with SSNC in Sweden and with Groundwork in South Africa, we're advocating already for a few years for more transparency and traceability of chemicals, and in this case also pesticides in products and materials. We envision a globally harmonized system for traceability and transparency. So this means every product, every t-shirt that you buy, you should be able to get all the chemical information. You should be able to get at least the minimum of information on hazardous chemicals and / pesticides. This will help to access the right to know. It will spark innovation, because then chemicals also have to be substituted. It will work against the system of double standards that we have. It will help authorities to gather information about the products that they import into their country. Also, if they do not have like very like many labs or many resources for that. And it will, of course, give consumers the right to make informed purchases, and it will help for safe recycling. So this is our idea. The idea is now mainstreamed a lot. We talk about this now in the plastic treaty, for instance. This is now enshrined also in these 2 targets in the Global Forum on Chemicals. And we are sure that this will also help regarding pesticides and products. So with this, next slide, please. I'm happy to end my short intervention here. Thank you very much. I'm happy to ask questions. And yeah, let's work all together to achieve really good, ambitious, strict regulation on pesticides everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. So now I'm going to give the floor to Rachel. Rachel, can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, okay.
Great.
So Rachel works at Oxfam in South Africa, and she has worked in global systems change on issues including pay equity, tax justice, climate justice, indigenous people's rights, labor rights, women rights, and just food systems. She's an advocate for interconnections and bridging worlds. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to the conference. Already so far, it's been amazing to hear all the incredible speakers, allies, comrades, and I'm really heartened to be in this struggle together. As Larissa said, I'm coming to you from South Africa. I live in a small town called Grabo. It's a big apple farming community, and unfortunately, many days I can see the spraying trucks from the front door of my house. And so this issue is definitely one of global injustice, national injustice, local injustice, and personal injustice. My partners also grew up in the smokestacks in a township in apartheid South Africa and has breathing problems from those times. And this certainly is not helping. So just to say, this political problem is personal, and as we know, the personal is political. I work for Oxfam, and we work across 79 countries with thousands of partners and allies on issues where we're trying to strive for a more equal world. And we're a human rights-based organization, we're a feminist organization, and we work really closely with partners and communities in all of these different countries. So that's who I am. And in our valley, in the valley I live in, we export, well, the big farmers export roughly 40% of all of all the apples exported from South Africa. Some companies in the valley that are huge say it's up to 70%. So the food that is grown in South Africa doesn't just stay in this country. And this is like a big problem. And as many of the speakers have talked about, there are so many issues around the use of pesticides, especially highly hazardous ones. And in particular, you know, the colonial double standard that's been mentioned time and again, the ecological destruction, the food system, the industrial food system we are currently trapped in, but hopefully not forever. It produces approximately a third of all greenhouse gas emissions as well. So we're in the midst of this climate crisis that is where pesticides and other big issues connected to the food system are really perpetuating the crisis. It's a corporate capture crisis as well. We know that, you know, it's not just governments, but it's the governments and corporations are sometimes too intertwined, and that these big issues that are impacting communities are really perpetuated by this, you know, sliding door in and out of corporations. So I think while the food system is, you know, roughly a third of all emissions, the food system also brings so much hope. And the people in our food system, and by those I mean the small scale producers, the farm workers, and anyone who's, you know, got a conscience that's a part of the food system, including all of us who eat our food. So I think we can have hope that there are other ways. The food system also is part of retaining soil health, which can absorb carbon, which can help us in the climate crisis. But as we know, with pesticide use and highly hazardous ones, it's really harmful for our environment and very harmful for workers and people. So I think we have to join hands. So what I wanted to speak about today is how we need to transition from this industrial agricultural system that is captured by corporates, you know, dominated by a few big companies and players globally, and shift us. We need to transition, just like we need to transition in energy. Just agricultural transition is really, really important for us as a whole planet, and to end the colonization, the racism, the inequality in our food system. And I think the solution lies with small-scale farmers, with the women farm workers, the organization that has been mentioned a few times, and you are lucky enough to have Carmen in the room with you and speak with you yesterday, Women on Farms Project. Those farm workers, not only do they speak out so strongly for their own rights around their health as they work and produce the food that we all eat, but they're also providing solutions. They're creating kitchen gardens in their backyards, you know, working without chemicals. And so they are also small-scale farmers. And small-scale farmers are 5 in every 6 farmer is a small-scale farmer, and those women, those men, those farmers are our solution to this crisis. Agroecology, as our comrade from Slow Food just said, is a really important mark on the horizon, but also a way we can put the resistance out there and really live the resistance to this industrial food system. There's been many technical solutions to this highly technical problem of ending the double standard with highly hazardous pesticides. And I'm in awe of the knowledge that has been, shared in this conference so far, and I'm sure will continue. So we need those technical solutions. What I'd also say, and what I think Dr. Aureliana said this morning, is we also need political solutions to this problem. And so to do that, we have to join hands. So what we're working on globally as Oxfam with many others, so it's really an alliance that I invite all of us to join hands, because I think many of us are doing different alliance work, including the IPSA alliance. But we must join hands and really bring that political solution and technical solutions together so that we can drive the change that's needed, and not wait for a treaty, push for a treaty, but in the meantime, live the difference we want to see. So we've kind of divided that into 4 pillars, which I'll just briefly touch on before I finalize. One is, I think, what we're hearing from the communities we work with is that we need more transparency on this issue. I'm not sure about you, but when I sit at a dinner table and tell someone about the double standard, people are really in shock. They're like, whoa, this actually happens. It happens still. It's the food I'm eating, and what? So I think amongst the general public, we need to raise the awareness of this issue. Our colleagues in Uganda also said they were recently at an agroecology conference, and this issue came up. There was testing, and they found 9 pesticides in the tomatoes they were eating, and this colleague had never heard of it before. So we are all learning daily about the depth. In fact, the last presentation by Alexandra made me quite shocked. I'm like, yo, menstrual products too? Oh no, they're everywhere. So I think we can all continue to learn about this issue and really do our best in every space to raise this on the agenda. So awareness raising is really important, both technically, but also politically. This imbalance, the inequality, as Carmen said, African lives have just the same value as European lives. And so why do we treat this so differently? Secondly, I would say we need accountability. And as Oxfam, we've worked, as my colleague Tim spoke yesterday, about holding companies accountable. There's a lot of corporate accountability that must take place. We've worked on supermarket supply chain accountability. There's new European legislation going in with this due diligence legislation. Let's use all these mechanisms to hold corporates and governments accountable. And doing that together only makes it stronger. As Dr. Eliana said, we have this relatively new 2022 UN right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Let's use that. Let's use the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Let's use the SDGs on decent labor rights. Let's work with our unions. So let's use all those accountability mechanisms, not only to hold our government accountable, but also these big corporations that are benefiting the most from all of this. So on that token, I just wanted to mention this push for an international treaty and an international regulatory framework that really crosses the paths of all of us. It cuts across that international legal frameworks. That's really important. And I think, as was mentioned, Dr. Rother also said, is this the most, prudent thing to go for? I feel it's so important to ask those questions. But again, I think it's a great mobilizing space. We can all get behind something. It also levels up the awareness as well, even just doing this. And it helps us, to organize across as alliances. And not to mention, when it does get passed, that will also be another great legal framework for us to all connect to. So there's transparency, there's accountability, and as I mentioned earlier, we need to also push alternatives. Many farmers, and there's much misinformation about what alternatives can work, if they can work, if we can feed the world. Well, we have so many small-scale farmers, and we need to support them in their efforts in agroecology globally so that we can have local food systems that have a smaller carbon impact, that have less toxic chemicals in our food. So really putting those solutions forward is a really, really important piece of this puzzle. And finally, we need to really have people power. There are more of us than there are numbers of corporations. So if we come together and we really make these alliances strong and push together through doing all of these pieces, accountability, awareness, and transparency, and pushing for alternatives. I think if we come together, we can do this. So I'd just like to end on an invitation. We're working next year on doing deep dive dialogues and convening them as an alliance, as a quite a wide alliance with our partners, the Waru Commission, our grassroots women's network, amongst many others. And I'd invite everyone to please be a part of this. We want to do deep dive dialogues on the issues that build what a just agricultural transition can and must look like. So we'll do those online throughout the year, and that would be wonderful if everyone can be involved. And then we're going to also host a kind of a global summit of sorts on what a just agricultural transition is from a people's grassroots perspective, hosted offline in Brazil on World Food Day next year. So it'll be wonderful if this alliance and IPSA and everyone here we can pull together and do this together to really put this out there on the political agenda. So I'll just say one last thing. Elena, my colleague, is in the room. She would love to connect with you. And Tim also. And of course, Carmen, our solid ally and comrade from Women on Farms project. And really wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And now I'm giving the floor to Susan Huffmans. Susan, just a moment. Susan Huffmans is an agricultural engineer with a broad range of work experience in national and international projects. Her work focuses on the use of pesticides in agriculture and corresponding regulations at national, European, and international level. She works as a senior advisor at the Pesticides Action Network Germany and is currently chair of PAN International, a global network of over 600 organizations in over 90 countries working to replace hazardous pesticides with ecologically sound and socially just alternatives. Thank you so much, Susan, for being here remotely, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Larissa. Thanks to the organizers for this important event, and thanks to all contributors and speakers. It is an amazing event with such a big importance, and I hope that a lot of people who haven't been involved that much are listening and taking home what everybody is sharing today. Are you sharing the presentation?
No, we can do. No, we can't. They think, just a moment, Susan.
If you can't, I could do it.
So please do
If
it. Yes.
Shall I try to do it?
Yes, please try to do it.
Okay, I have to switch screens. Let's see.
Yes.
So are you able to see the screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So thanks again. Yes, as introduced, PAN Germany is part of the big Pesticide Action Network International, and we inform about the harm done by pesticides. We are engaged to promote alternatives, non-chemical alternatives, and like organic farming and agroecology. So, the network is built on the regional centers, which are situated in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, and in Pacific and in Africa. So thanks a lot. So my contribution today is pesticide regulation and the need for global action. So we heard so much that, just to summarize, pesticides around the world, they contaminate water via infiltration, surface runoff and drift. They accumulate in the soil and have adverse effects on soil life. Knowing that soil is at the basis for our harvests, they become airborne, blown away and are found thousands of kilometers away from their use, and they're contaminating people and communities far away. They endanger biodiversity, and they also have the negative effects on people's health via residues in food, contamination of houses, especially for those living in agriculture areas. And that is not a problem of the Global South only, but we found those high contamination also in houses here in Europe. Millions of cases of unintended actual poisoning happen worldwide every year, and especially affecting people living and working in rural areas in the Global South. Those exposure and those poisonings are linked to chronic illness as well, like cancer, birth defects, like malformation, and so on, affecting people's life from the early beginning of their birth. And also, we heard yesterday, pesticides are also linked to and used in 1/5 of all suicides worldwide. So knowing all this, still the global use of pesticides is increasing. Looking at FAO figures here, we see where the increases are the strongest, and we see they are where the people are often in the most vulnerable situations, in South America and Africa and South and East Asia. So just looking at global challenges, so we see pesticides trade is done globally, the use is global, residues are being traded globally. We have the poisonings everywhere, contamination of resources, and all this is happening globally, while the regulation is mostly done nationally. So you already see this imbalance, and if we want to find solutions, we need to tackle this. We heard from Special Rapporteur Marcos Orellano about the deficits in the conventions, but just looking at them, only 3.4% of all pesticides on the market are covered by internationally recognized legally binding regulation like Stockholm, like Montreal Protocol or the Rotterdam Convention. So it's not only that there are some deficits in the conventions, but they only cover so little of pesticides. And then we heard a lot about highly hazardous pesticides, which are by definition acknowledged to present particularly high levels of acute or chronic hazards to health and the environment. And appear to cause severe or irreversible harm to health or the environment under the common condition of use. So that is like, it's a relatively small share, but those pesticides have a big impact on health, on communities, on the environment. And looking at exports, we heard a lot about double standards, and a lot of highly hazardous pesticides that has been taken from the European market are still being exported. This is a graphic from Public Eye. They examined the export notifications in Europe some years ago, and they could show that for 2018, 81,000 tons of EU-banned pesticides had been exported, and that the receiving countries, 3/4 of them were low and middle income countries. So we heard a lot. So, a pesticide that is cancerogen in Europe, it has the same hazard wherever it is being used. And we heard from UN experts on human rights that those health and environment impacts are externalized on the most vulnerable. And we see this situation, and it is all linked, and we have to solve this. We also heard about this mirror clauses, and we know that there's this boomerang effect. On the left-hand side, it's taken from a report from Larissa Bombardi showing the exported banned pesticides from Europe to Brazil, and then the same pesticides as residues being re-imported in, this is the example of grape, fresh grape, wine, grape juice. And our colleagues from Pesticide Action Network looked into, assessed all the official residue data from the official agencies, and could show that 69 banned pesticides are detected in European food. And so the most frequently have been like carbendazim. It's a fungicide. It's mutagenic and toxic to reproduction. Lyron and popiconazole, also fungicide, toxic to reproduction. And then we have those neonicotinoids like clothianidine, timetoxam, imidacloprid, insecticides, highly toxic to bee and also neurotoxic. So these are the two sides of the medal. And the good news is, regarding double standards, there is the problem is more and more being recognized, and first member states took steps. So we know that France and Belgium have now laws prohibiting the export, so prohibiting some of the exports of EU-banned pesticides, and setting an example that it is possible on the national level to act. So in Germany, we tried to get one, but it failed. I don't want to go into detail, but still there is hope that it is just slowed down. And Europe started a legislative process to introduce a mechanism prohibiting production and or export of certain hazardous chemicals that are banned in the EU. So it's the impact assessment and public consultation. So it isn't still ongoing, and we hope that this European Parliament and this EU Commission really commit to this process and support this process, that we at the end come up with a legal ban of those exports. What is the good news from this year is that the strategic dialogue on future of EU agriculture that was conducted with participation of farmers, of industry, of NGOs, and was presented by Madame von der Leyen in September only, states that when it came to review its negotiation strategies, that it includes an EU leadership by ending practice of unethical double standards, and that member states should stop exporting within the EU banned hazardous pesticides to countries with less stringent regulation. So that is a reconfirmation that there is willingness, and broadly. So we have heard about commitments at UN level as well. So the Global Framework on Chemicals have been mentioned, and this new framework, even though it is voluntary, it made significant commitments towards the phase-out of HHPs in agriculture to establish a global alliance on HHPs as a platform to make this happen and support safer and more sustainable agriculture practices, including agroecology. And also there's some wording about prohibiting the export of nationally banned chemicals. So, and even though it is voluntary, the stakeholder, it is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector approach, and they committed to it, every stakeholder participating. And we also saw that in the global biodiversity framework that mandates for 50% risk reduction for biodiversity from pesticides, and also to significantly increase in alternatives in pesticides in agriculture, including agroecology approaches. So that we all see this, and it is patchy, but there is a lot of going on. And I only focus now from the European perspective. I know that there's a lot of going on in southern countries. You hear from our partner organizations that there is a lot of engagement to get imports of those banned pesticides stopped, to phase out HHPs and so on. So if we want to see how to phase out HHPs and fight double standard to better protect people and planet from pesticides. So we all need to engage and support national and global phase out of HHPs. That is also reducing double standards if we can get less HHPs in use, and engage in the newly agreed global alliance, get countries to really commit to it and work in this alliance and set examples. I just want to mention that yesterday, the Pesticide Action Network International published the updated list of highly hazardous pesticides and the consolidated list of banned pesticides. And looking at this consolidated list of banned pesticides, you can see that around the world, countries have already banned a lot of highly hazardous pesticides. So there is experience, and let's look at them. How did they do it? And just follow their examples. So we should all engage for a legally binding global pesticide mechanism while we are supporting those non-binding improvements. But we should not wait for legally binding. We should engage for something legally binding, a mechanism, but as it will take long, so it shouldn't be an excuse not to act already today. And acting, I liked what Rachel said, like live the difference we want to see. So that starts at national level. So strengthen national pesticide regulation and enforcement, and also enforce export bans of nationally banned pesticides, as we heard also from the UN Special Rapporteur, and make corporations responsible for their projects and for the harm they cause, and limit their influence on regulative and political decisions. That is really important. And it is all, depending on the good non-chemical alternatives. So we need to promote them in pest management and crop protection at all levels. And it is possible, and it just needs to be supported. And with this, I thank you and give over and stop my screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Susan. So I'm giving the floor to Ikena, and then you finish as we are here in person. Would it be good? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Good morning from Nigeria. I trust you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you so very much. It's a great privilege to be here. I want to thank Marco. Yes.
No, just to say something about you.
Okay, go ahead.
As I've done for the others. So Ikena works in Nigeria, and is a prominent figure in Nigeria's civil society, currently serving as the program manager for Sustainable Nigeria at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Abuja. I think his biography is quite long. I think this is good enough to describe the importance of your work. So thank you so much, and go ahead.
All right. Okay. Thank you so very much. So within the Nigerian context, highly hazardous pesticide has been a major problem. It's been a major problem for the country revenue because we've observed and followed the discussion around, double standard in the exports of pesticides. We've seen all of the campaigns and appeal. And it seems somewhat that the industry and policy gain for profit seems to kind of like underline or go before safety and protection of the environment. In the Nigerian reality, was slowly beginning to tackle that really strong, exploring leverages and partnerships. The problem is clear. In 2018, we did some survey around smallholder women farmers, just like Rachel presented. Over 94% of smallholder women farmers in Nigeria use highly hazardous pesticides. From the survey and the interviews we did with these women, over 73% of them have complained of several health issues, from eye problems, skin problem, reproductive problem, which they directly relate to pesticides. Over 80% of them don't use protective equipment. And in as much as we've pushed all of this conversation, we've not seen a strong regional positioning either by ECOWAS or the EU. And from literatures, we've seen lots of convention and advice. An example is Article 7.5 in the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management. This was developed by WHO and FAO. And that section of the conduct says it advice. The word is advice. It's not a compulsion. So we've seen the absence of force. We've seen that even though we know that in a lot of developing countries, we cannot even afford safety because safety comes at a cost. And that cost, that reality does not exist. And it says that we need to prohibit the importation, distribution, sales, purchase of highly hazardous pesticide. We should consider this prohibition based on risk assessments, risk mitigation measures, and good market practice. If these good market practices are not sufficient and they are unacceptable risks to human environmental life. I think part of what Dr. Marco has already said, it's that we don't have that capacity. It does not exist in countries. In a lot of the samples where we need to get evidence on pesticide hazard, we have to take the samples abroad. What it simply means is we don't even have the labs to carry out the right tests. Pesticides are sold in open markets. Anybody can buy, even children. You could buy pesticides, you could put it in waters, in streams, and you could kill off a whole community and nobody has to be held accountable. This is no exaggeration. In 2018, 270 people died in Oyobi community in Benue State in Nigeria. Now, Benue State is known as the food basket of the country, And if you look at records, Nigeria has over 70% of its food exports banned in EU. So a lot of the food we export to EU, it's been rejected. Last year, we had the Japanese embassy write a letter to Farmers Association threatening that they're going to stop the imports. They'll stop importing sesame from Nigeria because of the presence of pesticides. Sesame farmers never used pesticide, but all of a sudden, it's now becoming a norm. The industry practices are pushing for pesticides, and this is threatening our revenue as a country. If you may be interested in the economics, Nigeria already spends close to 70% of, we're losing over 70% of our foreign revenues just in paying back debt. So the use of pesticide, it's costing Nigeria not just human lives or health lives, but a whole lot of revenue. It's pushing us into debt. We're planning to diversify our agricultural sector and increase exports. We can't do that because of pesticides. We're losing lots of revenue and the country is going into more debt, international debt. So this is me trying to speak economics, not life, because it seems the industry is not interested in the life of Africans. If we talk about the food sovereignty issue in Nigeria, we've had debates where we say it is not the responsibility of Europe or industries to stop the export of banned pesticides. And just as Dr. Marco has rightly said, we need stricter contingencies. We need nations to take responsibilities, but who controls the states? And I will give you a clear answer to that. In the case of Nigeria, in 2023, CropLife Nigeria, and we know who controls CropLife, we know the board members of CropLife, they actually presented a pesticide control council bill in Nigeria. Now, it is the industry that designed that bill. They rolled it through the Ministry of Agriculture. It got to our National Assembly. And under the case of very stringent case, we were able to get hold of that bill. An alliance was formed, Alliance for Action on Pesticide in Nigeria, to tackle that bill. And we realized that that bill was going to repel the food agency, environmental agencies, for making decisions as regards to pesticide safety and import in the country. That same bill is going to give members of CropLife 2 seats in the National Council. That same bill gives the minister the power to delegate power to members of the council. What it simply means is, if a minister is properly, let me use the word properly, bribed in foreign currency, he will relegate his power to members of the council who will be CropLife members, sponsored by CropLife International with their funding. A lot of these companies, we know the owner, they would make decisions, compromise the safety of Nigeria and bring in a lot of pesticides that we don't need. Already, a lot of our soil health are compromised. We have soils that can no longer grow indigenous seeds, so we have to depend on these big international corporations. Our food sovereignty is threatened. People don't have a right to decide what they want to eat. We don't have access to information to decide, to know what chemicals we want to eat, and what are their risks and what are their dangers. So this is not just a threat to our food. This is not just a threat to our health. It's a threat to our politics. It's a threat to our democracy. And the EU needs to make a bold stand and say, look, you respect the democracy and the decisions of the people. You cannot have your industries infiltrating national councils. I don't think any agricultural company in Nigeria would have access to a national council in Europe, in Germany, or any country. It would not happen. So this is a message from Nigerians for asking you to hold back your industries and tell them to stay away from national policies and national politics as regards to the decisions on food. A study that was done in 2023 already shows that over 60% of the pesticide registered and used in Nigeria are cancer-causing. 73% of them are endocrine disrupting. 63% of them are immunotoxic. 60% of them are neurotoxic. 60% of them, again, affect reproductive health. These are chemicals that are pushed by these industries. These industries are making strong attempts to infiltrate and control and push legislations and laws for our country. They are not democratic. So one of the things we would like to see in strengthening these international conventions is to see conventions taking strong positions that inform and push industries to do more research and development. Personally, I don't believe there's anyone who's solely evil, and I don't believe there's anyone who's solely good. Every businessman strives for profits, and he will do dirty business as long as policies and regulators and politicians are behind them or turn a blind eye. So I think it's time for us to start to put stringent measures in place to force industries to invest in research and development towards organic and agroecology. They have the money, all they need is the right sticks. I will not use the word carrot this time because it's a question of will. So I don't think existing conventions have been able to do that. So we need strong measures, strong decisions from our conventions, all of them, and a strong global ban on pesticide. My last words would be, we need some sort of like harmonization. Thank you, Susan, for that update as regards to the consolidated and updated pesticides, HHPs from Pesticide Action Network. I think it's time for us to see the World Health Organization and WHO upgrade their own list. We don't want that discrepancy because it gives a lot of room for the industries to seep through. Lastly, see, what goes around will always come around. The minute you start to disrupt the food system, existence, and well-being of the people, they would always come for you. Migration is already a big problem in EU. Nobody wants to leave their home and come to be, exist in someone else's country. But for us to do that, you must allow people and respect people to grow food the way they want to grow their food. Over 70% of what we eat are done by smallholder women farmers. A lot of these smallholder farmers want to grow their food organically. So in as much as over 90% of them are using highly hazardous chemicals, over 78% of them still use one form of organic method or traditional method or the other. So we need to see how we take a strong leadership position, and we want to still have hope in the EU to make that kind of leadership, provide that leadership, to see how we expand on knowledge, to see how we put in investment, push the industries. They are looking for profits. The demand for these chemicals are going down because knowledge is growing. People want to grow food behind their backyards. So they will chase the profit. So we need to just point them in the right direction to go to organic and bio inputs, as I would say. And agroecology is working. The evidences are there. A lot of smallholder farmers are doing that. Institutions and foundations are now producing several manuals on how to do this. And the evidence are there that they are working. So we need these conventions to be strengthened and expanded. We need to be able to stand up and say, look, there must be a global ban to stop the production, stop the supply, of highly hazardous pesticide. And when it's banned in Europe, it should be banned everywhere. We need each other. And I think we can get this to work. The technology has served its purpose. It's time for us to go to a new phase. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Então, muito obrigada, Ekena. Para fechar essa mesa, eu vou passar a palavra para a Lena, da Fundação Boll, da Boll Foundation. A gente vai inverter um pouquinho a ordem do final do dia. A Lena vai fazer o fechamento dessa mesa e daí a gente não vai fazer o intervalo. Como o Dr. Marcos Orellana está saindo, a gente vai fazer um breve lançamento da carta, da ideia da Carta de Bruxelas, e daí retomamos. Obrigada, Lena.
Yes, thank you very much, Larissa. There should be a presentation. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks so much. It's an honor to be here, to be part of this conference. Thanks so much to the organizers for all this great work, and I'm very grateful also for the wonderful speakers that we already heard today and yesterday. So I'll be very brief because so much has been said already. I still wanted to lay a special focus. So I'm heading the International Agricultural Policy Division at Heinrich Böll Foundation, based in Berlin. So I'm also regularly in touch with my colleagues across different continents. So like Marcelo, who spoke yesterday, and Ekena, who just spoke. So many of our offices are doing a great work also in this fight against hazardous pesticides together with partners. I want to lay a special focus today on the pesticide producers, and especially German pesticide producers, because there's a lot of NGOs, civil society organizations in Germany that are trying to really challenge producers like Bayer and BASF, and share a bit of insights about like their market power and also lobbying strategies. So exactly what I will be talking about is, on the one hand, briefly, what are the big players in the trade or the sale of hazardous pesticides. I will talk about companies' profits, like how this model is very lucrative, and lobbying strategies. And maybe I will skip the third part, and so we can come to Marcus directly. So here, this is a graph from ETC, etc. Group, the Food Barons Report from 2022. It just shows the market power, like who are the biggest pesticide companies currently. I guess most of you know that there's been a wave of mega mergers in like 2017, 2018. So now basically we only have 6 large companies, and 4 of them are controlling 62% of the global pesticide market. So number 1 is the Syngenta Group. Syngenta Group was formed by, on the one hand, Chinese companies, ChemChina and Sinochem, plus the Swiss company Syngenta, plus the Israeli company Adama. I think this is not showed. Yes, it's showed there in the second column. So this is Syngenta Group. It's the number one in the pesticide market. Number two is German company Bayer. This is only since Bayer bought Monsanto in 2018. Number three is BASF, also a German company, so that's why I'm focusing also on those German companies. And number four is Corteva. Corteva was formed by another merger, also in 2018, between DuPont and Dow Chemical. So we have those four mega corporations when it comes to the pesticide trade, the pesticide market. And of course, this large economic power also translates into political power. So here again, just to show, this is a graph from our pesticide atlas, just to show how big the share of highly hazardous pesticides is in terms of sales, of total sales. So here you see on the one hand like the important producing countries, or also using countries that use most chemicals. But you also see the large corporations. Those are all five companies that are part of CropLife. And for example, you see that for Syngenta, 40% of total sales are made only with highly hazardous pesticides. In the case of Bayer, it's more than a third of sales made only with highly hazardous pesticides. In the case of BASF, it's a fourth of the sales. So just selling highly hazardous pesticides is a very, very lucrative model for those big companies. Susan already talked about this export from the EU, so 81,000 tons of pesticides. So I will skip that. And I just also selected the second graph from the same report from Public Eye and Greenpeace on Earth that also shows the importing countries, the largest importing countries. So number one is United States, but then you would see Brazil, Japan, Ukraine, Morocco in other countries. So Brazil is definitely a big market that receives pesticides from the EU. This included the UK back then. On the right-hand side, the graph you see here is just to show like how lucrative this model of selling pesticides was, and we see this. So on the bottom line, it's fertilizer companies. You can ignore that for now. But the top is Syngenta, Bayer, and BASF, and this is just the number of how much they increased their profits in 2022 compared to 2021. So 2022 was a very lucrative year for many players in the agri-food chain, also for grain traders, for fertilizer companies, because the prices, the global market prices went up so much. And these were like pure windfall profits. So you can really see if you look into the reports of the companies that they basically didn't do anything else. Just global market prices were so much higher, so they profited a lot more. So one argument that we've been saying is it would totally make sense to have a windfall profit tax, not only for energy companies, but also for companies along the food supply chain, because those extra profits are not earned. They should be redistributed to the people who, need to adapt to actually the damage that those companies are doing. And just to give 2 examples of lobbying, concrete lobbying activities that these big companies are doing, just to show how this market power also translates into political power, is on the one hand, the pesticide industry gained political influence through a new strategic partnership between FAO and CropLife International. So Bayer, BASF, Corteva, FMC, and Syngenta, and this partnership, which started in 2020 under China's FAO presidency, has been criticized by so many civil society organizations. And finally, this is the good news, in May this year, the FAO officially ended its partnership, but still there was this strong partnership. Another example would be like how at EU level, the pesticide industry would strongly advocate against a pesticide reduction, but I will not go into detail here. And in Germany, we can also report, like I've been collaborating with Susan a lot with Pan Germany on a German export ban. And we've seen how Bayer, BASF, and also Alzchem, as another German pesticide company, have strongly lobbied against a national export ban. So I think this is the last slide I will talk about. You heard Peter Klausing yesterday, also from Pesticide Action Network. He was one of the authors of this very, very important study on global distribution of acute unintentional pesticide poisoning. So they actually came out at the end of 2020, I think it was. Yes, December 2020. They came out with these numbers, estimations. They always say it's estimations of 385 million people being poisoned every year. And so there was a huge fuss about this study, and not in 2020, but actually we used this number in the Pesticide Atlas in 2022. I mean, already in 2021, as I state here, there were employees of Bayer and CropLife who wrote a letter to the editor regarding the estimation of global pesticide poisoning. And the criticism is about the methodology, and that some numbers, I mean, they're only estimates, of course, and some numbers should not be recognized, whatever. It would change the total number by 0.4, 0.6%. It's nothing. But still, obviously, the pesticide industry didn't like those numbers. And now we had a hearing in German parliament in October this year. And right before this hearing, so it was a long process, but finally, right before this hearing, this paper was retracted officially. And obviously, this should be like the very, very last step if something is really misinformation or disinformation. So this again was a very, very strong example of like industry lobbying. Yes, I think I will stop here. I will not go into detail about the narratives because we already talked about this, and super happy to still hear from Marcos Orellana about the wonderful letter.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Lena. And I think this example is the subtitle of the lobby in general. I mean, subtitle as a joke I'm using, you know, but it's exactly what's going on when we are denouncing the pesticides issues. So thank you so much. I'm closing this session, and Dr. Marcos Orellana is leaving. I'm going to give the floor to Sergio just to close this session. Podemos falar em português.
Então, amigos, estamos chegando na parte final já da nossa conferência, né? E dado o avançado do horário e também, né, o voo do Dr. Marco Orellana, a gente vai fazer pequenos ajustes aqui na ordem dos fatores, né? E vamos lançar, então, né, na verdade, anunciar, né, o site do IPSA, que é ipsaglobal.org, né? Pode colocar www, ou pode colocar esse https://. Lá vocês vão encontrar, né, o statement, né? A gente está lançando hoje aqui, então, a partir de todas as discussões que a gente teve no dia de ontem, no dia de hoje, esse Brussels Statement, né? Que é como se fosse uma carta, um documento final dessa conferência, que tenta, de alguma maneira, endereçar o que foi trazido aqui, né? Então, faz algumas sugestões, algumas considerações, a necessidade, né? Isso ficou claro também na fala do Dr. Orellana,
uma coordenação, né, de esforços. A gente viu aqui experiências tão ricas e interessantes de tantas instituições trabalhando nesse nível tanto mais nacional, regional e global, para avançar, né, com essa criação desse standard internacional. Mas eu diria, né, Larissa foi a autora aí desse documento, desse Brussels Statement, junto com, né, colaborações aí do Dr. Marco, do Dr. Pedro Arojo, né, da Pesticide Action Network também. Então a gente vê que cada instituição está com uma abordagem, né? A Andrea também trouxe vários ângulos importantes da questão. Então, assim, né? Mas não tem uma coordenação entre isso tudo, não tem uma inteligência, não tem uma estratégia. E eu acho que esse Brussels Statement ele vem justamente nessa direção de como a gente pode coordenar os nossos esforços, né, para a gente otimizar recursos, né, e também para a gente poder ter um trabalho mais efetivo e avançar de forma consistente nos próximos anos, né? Como foi colocado, um tratado não é uma coisa trivial, né? Tivemos aí agora o do plástico, o anterior Minamata 10 anos antes. Então isso é uma caminhada de médio e longo prazo, mas que a gente tem que iniciar desde já, né? Eu acho que esse Brussels Statement, então, que a gente está lançando hoje, né? Que vocês vão poder em algumas horas já encontrar dentro do site do IPSA, ele dá esse tom dessa aliança mesmo, né, que é o espírito desse grupo, dessas organizações todas que estão se coordenando e se articulando para avançar. Então, eu queria só, né, passar a palavra para o Dr. Marco para uma saudação final, né, agradecer muito sua presença, agradecer muito a presença do Dr. Pedro Arojo também, que foi um colaborador importante, que é o reporter da ONU, né, para segurança hídrica, saneamento e direitos humanos. E, mais uma vez, agradecer também, né, a European Anti-Poverty Network por nos receber aqui nesse espaço tão especial, nessa segunda parte da nossa conferência. Então é isso, doutor Marcos.
Muchas gracias, Sergio. Muchas gracias nuevamente por la invitación a participar en esta conferencia, por la oportunidad de estar aquí. Yo voy a ser muy breve y solo quiero felicitar a las organizaciones que han acudido y convocado a este espacio por mantener abierta una conversación que es sumamente importante en el día de hoy. Como hemos podido escuchar de varios y varias expositoras el día de hoy y ayer también, hay muchos ángulos que están implicados en la temática de los plaguicidas. Hay temas científicos, hay temas técnicos, hay temas de la experiencia en comunidades, hay temas regionales, hay una dimensión global del asunto. Todos estos temas es muy importante traerlos a colación, abordarlos de manera sistemática, de la manera en que se ha hecho en esta conferencia, para lograr movimiento, para lograr pasos hacia adelante, porque la realidad que enfrentamos es una realidad de crisis, una realidad dramática, de violaciones a los derechos humanos de carácter grave y sistemático. Entonces, tal vez el mensaje, quisiera hacer eco a algunas de las cosas que he escuchado hoy, la importancia de unir fuerzas, ¿no? de lograr un paraguas común con objetivos compartidos para lograr movimiento en diferentes espacios. Puede haber una estrategia que sea de varios niveles, de varios sectores, pero encaminada en una dirección común. Y esa dirección común me parece que hoy día la hemos visto cristalizar muy claramente en lo que es el impacto de los plaguicidas altamente peligrosos. Y entonces por eso quisiera nuevamente felicitar a los organizadores y las organizadoras, agradecer la oportunidad de estar aquí y alentar a seguir adelante con mucha fuerza, porque el camino, claro, no termina aquí, ¿no?
O doutor Marcos vai ter que sair agora por conta do voo dele. Muitas graças. Ok. Muitas graças. E a gente segue, né, Larissa, para a parte seguinte aqui que estava aí na programação, que é o lançamento, né, do livro. Tem como trazer aqui mais unidades do livro, José? Vamos chamar para... Doutor Pedro, vem aqui, Roseno, vem aqui o pessoal, só para a gente tirar uma foto. Marcelo, colegas aqui, Lena, aqui o pessoal da Slow Food também. Dá um minutinho aqui, aproveitar o momento com o doutor Marco Aureliano para fazer um registro aqui desse momento importante, né? O pessoal da Oxfam também, por favor, os parceiros aí podem chegar aqui para a gente tirar foto. There is a way to project the layout from the event here in the... Thank you.
We have everybody to go everybody here, then we can. Não quer conseguir pegar um negócio embaixo, mas. Esse também?
Vamos em diálogo.
Não por isso.
Esse é seu? Ah, de quem que é esse?
Você pode mandar para mim.
Isso que eu queria. Peraí, a gente vai lançar agora. Peraí. Vai levar. Larissa, então é só fazer uma explicação sobre o livro brevemente. Esse livro, então, ele foi lançado, né, pelo IPSA, juntamente com a Escola Superior do Ministério Público da União e pelo CIRAT, então, em maio desse ano, de 2024, no Fórum Mundial da Água, lá em Bali, na Indonésia. Depois ele foi lançado em junho, né, dentro do Auditório Nereu Ramos, do Congresso Nacional do Brasil, né? Larissa estava com a gente também, que foi a primeira conferência, né, que a gente realizou desse tipo, que foi realizada no Sul Global, e a gente trabalhou então para realizar uma conferência próxima, com a mesma proposta, no Norte Global, que é essa que a gente está aqui, né, em Bruxelas, na sede do Parlamento Europeu, e nesse segundo dia aqui na European Anti-Poverty Network. Né? Então, é uma publicação que reúne, né, pesquisadores de referência no mundo, mas também políticos, lideranças da sociedade civil, pesquisadores, né, para trazer vamos dizer assim, um apanhado, né, das principais questões, dos principais movimentos, dos principais desafios para o avanço dessa agenda da criação de um standard internacional. Né, já foi também articulado e já está em produção, né, uma nova edição da publicação, né, junto com o Senado Federal, né, que é tanta coisa que está acontecendo que a gente tem que sincronizar os movimentos. Né? A energia agora estava para a conferência acontecer e o próximo passo é realmente essa segunda edição dessa publicação com apoio da Comissão Editorial do Senado Federal, né, do Brasil, E é isso, a gente está bem feliz de estar lançando essa publicação. Nós temos algumas unidades aqui, para quem, poucas unidades, né, para quem quiser levar. É um livro bilíngue, né, inglês e português, e está à disposição aqui para quem quiser levar. Eu vou passar para a Larissa aqui para ela fazer um complemento.
Sim, só dizer que o livro caminha no esforço que a gente fez hoje, por exemplo, ontem, na ideia de encontrar um caminho regulatório para isso. Eu achei importante o Marcos Orellana ter levantado a questão de que um tratado, às vezes a função do tratado é trazer visibilidade e pontuar a importância da gente olhar para algum tema. Essa é a primeira importância. Então, o livro trouxe autores de diferentes lugares do mundo e acho que esse movimento é o mais importante, a gente se reconhecer nos outros, reconhecer o movimento que está sendo feito nos outros países, as formas de enxergar a questão de maneiras que a gente não havia pensado. Então, para mim, tanto a experiência do livro quanto os debates que a gente teve aqui nesses 2 dias foi muito rico. Acho que a gente vai construindo caminhos importantes. Enquanto a gente não abole, não elimina de fato essa lógica, completamente essa lógica injusta da forma como essa sociedade está estruturada, que não está apenas relacionada apenas com agrotóxicos. Eu diria que os agrotóxicos são a forma talvez mais visível e uma das mais nefastas dessa enorme desigualdade que acompanha essa sociedade. Então, esse livro, eu penso, retrata esse caminho, essa busca por desenvolver uma regulação internacional para agrotóxicos, que nos parece, cada vez mais, escutando tudo que escutamos esses 2 dias, o caminho mais ajustado para a gente, né? Porque todo mundo já tem feito tanto aqui nesse caminho, mas um caminho que nos une a todos numa linguagem comum para fazer frente a esse problema. Aí agora, finalmente, uma última coisa, e concluindo o evento, tem espera só um pouquinho. Eu vim, nos últimos anos, desenvolvendo uma ferramenta junto com colegas da cartografia e de tecnologia, desenvolvedores de softwares, um atlas virtual. Tudo isso que vocês viram da minha apresentação e de outras pessoas que também usaram o meu atlas, os meus mapas, a gente desenvolveu uma ferramenta que possibilita, ver esses mapas sob diferentes perspectivas. A gente pode olhar como eu vou dizer, José, se você puder mexer um pouquinho e brincar um pouco a gente pode escolher a variável com que a gente vai, na qual a gente vai focar. Por exemplo, eu posso olhar o número de pessoas contaminadas por agrotóxicos, por estado, por município, por região. Essa ferramenta está em inglês e em português. Por exemplo, aqui é um caso do mapa sobre o uso de agrotóxicos em 2009. Eu posso escolher o ano, eu posso escolher o estado, eu posso escolher a região, entende? É um atlas dinâmico, é um atlas interativo. Talvez essa seja a melhor forma de descrever. Então, tem várias informações. Por exemplo, eu posso sobrepor informação de uso de agrotóxicos e saber isso de acordo com o bioma. Eu posso enxergar as unidades de conservação, eu posso enxergar os territórios indígenas, eu posso ver informações sobre tipo de agrotóxico. Por exemplo, eu posso ver quanto de glifosato é usado. Eu posso, nesse caso, por exemplo, aqui é um mapa do uso de glifosato por região. Enfim, é uma forma. Essa ferramenta foi pensada como digamos assim, de fato, uma ferramenta para assessorar os movimentos sociais, para assessorar as entidades da sociedade civil que atuam com esse tema. operadores do direito, enfim, a ideia é de que isso possa nos servir para a gente avançar nesse tema. Por incrível que pareça, no Brasil, a gente tem muitos dados, os dados são oficiais, os dados são públicos, por isso a gente pode criar algo como isso. Os colegas da PAN têm sempre nos alertado sobre a falta de transparência dos dados na União Europeia, a falta de acesso público a esses dados. Então, eu penso que essa ferramenta também pode nos ajudar aqui na União Europeia a pressionar para que a gente possa ter acesso a dados como esses e possamos também ter uma ferramenta desse tipo para poder, de fato, pressionar o poder público, para a gente mesmo entender onde é que estão as áreas com a população mais vulnerabilizada, onde se usa mais, aonde está sendo mais contaminado. Isso é uma ferramenta, eu penso, que deve ser ampliada para o mundo. Talvez, se a gente for pensar nessa ideia de tratado, os dados devem fazer parte disso que a gente busca. A gente precisa ter uma normatização de dados e informações em nível mundial, eu acredito. Então, eu espero que esse seja um primeiro passo, digamos, aqui o estado do deputado Renato Rosé, no Ceará, por exemplo, enfim, vocês podem depois acessar, o link vai ficar aqui disponível, vocês podem olhar e brincar. É uma ferramenta experimental, acho que é importante dizer isso, não é algo pronto. Ela está sendo lançada hoje como uma ferramenta experimental, depois de muitos anos, gente, eu tenho até vergonha, porque acho que tem uns 5 anos, mas, enfim, como tinha a conferência, eu pensei, a gente tem que fazer todos os esforços para que ela esteja pronta para a conferência. E, então, quero agradecer o apoio que a gente teve da Fundação Oswaldo Cruz, um instituto de pesquisa muito importante no Brasil, muito comprometido com a saúde pública. Eles é quem fomentaram a finalização, o trabalho final de edição e de informática para que essa ferramenta pudesse estar pronta. Então, bem, quero fechar a conferência agradecendo a presença de todos vocês. Eu diria que, apesar de todos os desafios técnicos que nós tivemos, de muitas ordens, os relatos e as apresentações foram incríveis, eu penso. Então, acho que o grande mérito é de cada um de vocês que trouxe essa riqueza de colaboração, compartilhando os trabalhos que vocês têm feito no mundo todo. Queria finalmente agradecer minha grande amiga Juliana Walgren por ter disponibilizado esse espaço. Caso contrário, não teríamos um lugar para a segunda parte da conferência. Obrigada, Juliana. Obrigada, meus filhos queridos também, que estão aqui no rolê, não sei como traduzir, no rolê com a mãe, enfim, estão... As intérpretes, né? Enfim, para os filhos que estão aqui juntos nessa luta. Nossa, a única hora que a gente... Sim, um obrigada final ao Iane pela assessoria de comunicação, ao José que veio na beira do mestrado para poder salvar a realização. Posso?